Thank you very much. I'm going to start, of course, by echoing what the other four women who are here with us this afternoon have said. It's such an enormous honour and so highly unexpected to be a member of this shortlist. I'm used to working in states of high emotion and end-of-life care, but finding out I was on this shortlist completely blew my mind. So, with the end in mind, is the book that I was waiting for somebody to write. I waited my whole professional life for somebody to write a book that gave us normal dying back. And eventually it occurred to me that possibly nobody was going to get round to writing it. I would like us to try and get real about dying, because actually I think it's something that we have forgotten the wisdom about in the developed world. This tree is about 500 years old. It's the angel oak in the outskirts of Charleston in South Carolina. And I photographed it about 3 years ago when I was visiting, and it was having its 500 and something spring. It looks as though it's eternal, but actually it's going to die. I'm going to die. You're going to die. Everybody you really like is going to die. People you don't like are going to die as well. It made me think about survival. It made me think about how we are so well evolved to protect ourselves from death. We've got all of these mechanisms that keep us alive. So, you know, if you breathe in dust or try and eat a sweet that's too big for the back of your mouth, you'll cough and you'll splutter and you'll clear your airway, and that's really important. And if there's something too hot or too sharp, we've all had this experience, haven't we, where you touch it and then you withdraw. Actually, even before the swear word has come out of your mouth, you've moved. These are reflexes that protect us, as does that adrenaline rush when there's a articulated lorry or a saber-toothed tiger, depending on when in evolution it happened to you, gets oxygen to your brain and to your muscles so that you can think really fast and move very strongly and protect yourself. But what we don't think about so much is that we're also evolved to protect ourselves from distress. And the thing about protecting ourselves from distress is we don't always see the psychological swerves we make to enable us to not think about the thing that we don't want to think about. And so there'll be some people in here who don't like spiders. Can I have a show of hands for this yet? Okay, actually more than usual. Okay, so I'm not going to show you pictures of spiders or anything like that, just calm down. But people who don't like spiders arrange their lives so they don't have to see spiders. Am I right? Yeah? They won't go on a camping holiday because the toilet blocks are in a field with, yeah, okay. But not just that, they will arrange their lives so that they don't have to think about thinking about spiders. And we do that about death. We don't want to think about death. We don't want to think about our own death, our bereavement for people who we've loved who have died, or the fact that the people we love will die in the future. And we don't see the psychological swerves that we make to get round it. The difficulty is that in the developed world, not only are we making the psychological swerves to not encounter dying, but at the same time as that, because of some of the healthcare developments that have already been described today, and because of better sanitation and better nutrition, our life expectancy is so long that adults who are as old as me, or even as old as my cousin in the audience, have reached a great age without, in fact, seeing the deaths of people who were dear to us. That, you know, parents are living into their 80s, and our siblings are living into their 80s. And I'm dealing now at work with people who are seeing a parent die, and it's the first person they've seen die, and they are now in their 60s themselves. And because we've lost that wisdom, we now don't like to think about or talk about it, and we're losing the vocabulary. We don't say the D words: dying, death, disintegration. And that's a problem. The problem is that psychologically we want to avoid thinking about dying, and yet we don't tolerate a vacuum of knowledge. So what we don't know, we make up. But we don't know that we've made it up. We don't know what we don't know. And we take our references for death from popular culture. So we see soap opera deaths, or we love death. We read detective stories and we play shoot-'em-up games with big blood splats, and Lindsay likes her splats, doesn't she? Or we like gory death. In fact, the soap operas keep having a run at it, and then they almost do a good death, and then, Dot slips her a Mickey Finn at the very end, or somebody gets a liver transplant just as he could have done a really good public service by dying properly. And really, the only good depiction I've seen of terminal illness in cinema is this is Tom Hanks as Andy in Philadelphia, and the terminal illness is actually fantastic, but you don't see him die. There's that kind of reunion with Denzel Washington character, and then they cut to a graveyard. This is downtown Otavalo in Ecuador in the Andes. This is an agricultural town. In a high street, there is a funeral shop. In fact, there are 4 funeral shops in this street, because one thing that we're never going to not do is die, which I might have mentioned. And you can see you can choose your own coffin. You can have a smart one, you can have a plain one. They're not going in yet for the green burials, because they are a volcanic country and everybody has to be buried above ground. That doesn't make sense, does it? So there's a tiny little white coffin there, which is for a baby. You can choose your funerary pomp while you're there. And because they're a developing economy, people die with a shorter life expectancy than we have. So people in their 20s and 30s are seeing parents and grandparents die. They're familiar with death. And so look what the shop next door is. The shop next door is a cafe. It's doing a roaring trade, and on the other side there's a greengrocer's. And this is something that people think about, and we've lost that wisdom. So my book is a window into the world of dying. I've simply written what happens to people. I'm simply telling people's stories. It's not clever, it's not medical. It's simply saying, here's a guy who's trying to protect his wife. So when I arrive at his house, he invites me in and he says, "You're not going to tell her, are you?" And he shows me up to the bedroom where she's sitting all on her own, and the house is so tidy. He's doing everything to look after her. So she sends him downstairs for a cup of tea. Make the doctor a cup of tea. And he doesn't want to leave the room because he's sure I'm going to say something that's going to upset her. And as he's going out of the door, he's looking at me and going, and she can't see round the door. And as soon as she hears his feet on the stairs, she says, "I don't know what to do. I don't know how to tell him." It's stories of the woman whom I met when she was a young girl about to be married, having chemotherapy. I was working in oncology, and we were giving her chemotherapy to try and cure her. And then I met her again about 4 years later, and she now was dying of the same cancer that she'd never really admitted she had. And she wasn't going to talk about it now either. And how were we going to help her family to say goodbye to her if she was still saying, "Well, I want to have about 4 children, and I want to learn to windsurf." And she had names for those children. So we had to engineer a conversation in which her family could reminisce and tell her all the wonderful things that they appreciated about her, without actually saying, "And you're dying, don't you?" And she was still saying, "I'm going to beat this thing," 20 minutes before she lapsed into unconsciousness. It tells the story of Ujjal, fantastic Indian bank manager, such a great guy, who was a little bit muddled as his kidneys were failing because his heart was failing. And in his muddledness, he was in hospital. He thought he was on the night train to Delhi, which was interesting. And he was very grumbly that there was no chai when the steward came round. The steward was, in fact, a staff nurse who realized what was going on. And instead of trying to reorientate him, she boarded the night train to Delhi with him. And she talked to him about where he was going, and he was going to pay his respects to his parents, but he was worried that he couldn't find his tickets and he couldn't find his passport. And when people are dying and they're a little bit muddled, they live in a land of metaphor for departures. And this nurse realized that if he was looking for tickets and passports, he was probably dying, and sent for his wife, and we sorted out how to get him home to where he wanted to be. So the stories are just stories that replace the lost wisdom that we have had from having people die amongst us and around us. And my hope is that by doing that, I'll reintroduce the process that dying is, the biological process, just as much as giving birth is a process, a sequence of events where one follows another in a reasonably predictable fashion, just as sunset follows the daytime. And like wise midwives, we can, in antenatal care, understand what might go wrong by understanding this pregnancy and where the baby's sitting and where the placenta is. So we wise death wives, by understanding the illness that the person is dying from, can prepare to ensure that their symptoms remain well managed during the process of dying. So the book has reflections that will invite you, if you read it, to think about how can I apply those lessons in my life. Who's my village? Who's going to tell Dr. Mannix when she says, what would your friend, your mum, your husband want? Who's going to know my mind well enough to say what I would want in extremis? So my invitation to you is to go home tonight and think cheerfully about your own death, and to think about who understands you and who knows what you might want to happen, and make sure that your views can be represented by the people who love you when that inevitable time comes. So I want to thank you for listening. I want to thank those of you who've written to me, and the many other people who've written to me to tell me how much they've been helped by reading these stories and rearranging their understanding of what they have seen as people have died. Re-understanding that the funny noises we make with automatic breathing are not groaning, for example. So I'm really grateful that people have written to me to let me know that it's helped them to be less afraid. So I would like to wish us all an extremely good evening, a really fruitful life, and a really well-prepared and peaceful death. Thank you.